thing or anyone you want.
All right, let's do
Cool.
this.
Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of This is Tech Talks. And my name is Santosh, and I'm with my co-host Jay and Lars here today with our special guest Ran. So, hey Lars, hey Jay, how are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, Santosh?
Doing great. I think after a long time, we all three are together here.
Yeah,
Been months.
and I'm
Yeah,
here to
actually,
meet Ryan again.
yeah. Yeah, I know Lars was really excited about this episode. So, how are you, Ryan?
Yeah, I mean, Lars was the first interview that I did working on Solid. I hadn't really talked to anyone. I was just doing my own open source project, and he's one of the pretty much the first person that actually reached out and said, "Hey, come on a podcast. Let's talk about Solid. Tell people about it."
Oh,
Cool.
nice. Cool. So, how's your day so far, Ryan?
Still early for me. I was just got up, just got started. Just had to make a few quick rearrangements of my schedule right last minute because I'm going to be doing a stream later on with the guys from Quick and to show me Quick City, but they needed to slightly rearrange some stuff, so I was like last minute, like changing some times around and stuff. But it's all good.
Okay. Cool. Thanks again for your time. I mean, I know you have been really busy nowadays, but thanks again for giving us time to do this episode. And let's go ahead and get started. So, I'm the people who don't know about Ryan, so Ryan is actually creator of SolidJs and he's part of Marco Dev team, as well as he's writing for us. Thanks a lot, Ryan, for actually being part of This Is Learning, and you have been writing amazing articles. I read all of them, and they are really informative. So thanks for doing that. But would you like to introduce yourself? I mean, I know you have a lot of things to say, so over to you.
I guess how should I put it? I am an open source developer who created a JavaScript framework called SolidJs, but it's more than just creating a framework. I'm very passionate about JavaScript frameworks, reactivity, performance, and for that reason, I write about it a lot or stream about it. I do a bit of that as well. Just kind of completely engross myself in the whole I guess open source, learn in public lifestyle. That's basically, I guess, how I would put it. But yeah, I guess I was working at eBay for the last couple of years, working on the Marco framework as well. And then most recently, I started working at Netlify to work full time on open source.
Nice. Jealous.
It's pretty awesome.
I bet.
So just to know, Ryan, so how you started with open source? I mean, what was your first introduction? Okay, this is how you started, or what was your first PR? We would like to actually hear that story.
My first start with open source wasn't like the smoothest experience. Basically, two things had been going on. I guess my first introduction of actually getting into it was I started working for a startup in 2012, and they decided to completely build their whole stack themselves and open source it. And I mean, this isn't actually that unheard of during that time period. There's a lot of things that were missing in the Node ecosystem and the JavaScript ecosystem. So like we were looking for JavaScript ORM that could also work all the way onto the client. So they built it. Something that it reminds me a bit of actually GraphQL now in hindsight, but it was not nearly as good, but it was pretty cool. And the funniest thing is I came up working in like Microsoft shops and having Visual Studio and like having autocompletes and doing the whole thing. And this is way before like VS Code and stuff, you know? So when I got there, they're like, yeah, so our recommended tooling is like use Sublime Text or Notepad++. It's kind of funny because I was kind of excited at the same time because like way back in the day, I used to like just make websites in Notepad, or so to speak. So like I was like, okay, sure, like this is a big departure, right? This is all JavaScript, the rise of single page app kind of time period. But I have to admit, I was spoiled by the stuff that I was doing with the Microsoft kind of official partner thing. And so when I came over, I was like the worst. Whenever there was bugs or issues in our products, I'd just be like, this is missing documentation. This is a bug. And I just kind of like push it back on the lead dev because I was like expecting everything just to be there. And and at a certain point, he said to me, he's like, you can just look at the source code. Like you don't have to like just be like, oh, it doesn't work and just push it off. And I'm like, I can. I know this is like such an obvious thing, but I've been working so long ingrained in this kind of thing where you didn't have that kind of control. And yeah, instantly it took me back to the beginnings of my web development career, like in the late 90s or whatever, where I was just like viewing the source on web pages. And I was like, this is awesome. Like I felt like I could do anything again. And I got really excited about it. Of course, taking that knowledge and going out in the world with it is a whole different thing. Because we were like a CoffeeScript shop, and I'd gotten so used to using CoffeeScript almost exclusively for about 3 or 4 years at that point, that when I went to go like make my first PR, it was a web component PR for a polyfill by I think it's called Component Register by Andrea Giamarchi of Web Reflection. And I went to go there, and I'm like, we need to pass stuff in so we can do natural native built-ins. So we need to do this argument. He's like, yeah, you're right. We should do that. So yeah, go ahead and make a PR. And I was like, oh, okay. So I went in and did it, and then I tried to add the test. And eventually he was just like, I really appreciate the effort, but I'm just going to take this one on myself. Because what had ended up happening was I was trying to copy the patterns he was doing without fully understanding them. So because I was like, do I assign something or do I define it as a property? And he had he's very performance oriented. And he had all these things. And for myself, I'm like CoffeeScript developer, like was not thinking in this zone. And my tests, I forgot to declare like the vars and for all the variables. I just started using them. It's like you're making all the variables in global scope. And I'm just like, oh man, I so did. I was like so embarrassed because I hadn't written JavaScript for a while. And I basically just like took all my CoffeeScript isms into JavaScript, and it was just terrible. So yeah, he just ended up just doing the work himself in the end. So my first PR did not get merged. But essentially, this was kind of like a starting point, working at that startup. And about 2 years or 2.5 years into it, the original creator of all these libraries, he moved on. It's a lot maintaining this stuff. And he was also like a C-level at this company. And, I think he ended up walking away, and I was left sort of maintaining internally those libraries. I didn't really do a good job of externally maintaining them, I have to admit. My focus was the product that we were working on, but suddenly I had a whole stack that was custom that no one else was going to update if there was bugs. So I was thrust into it, and I had a couple choices, right? We could go replace everything with React by that time, but we'd already built a custom stack, and we kind of liked our custom stack. So I started by replacing pieces of it with what I wanted to do, I guess. So something I'd be interested in, like try to streamline it and reduce it so we could reduce the maintenance burden, right? I started replacing it with libraries that weren't open source, but things I'd written that were smaller, and just kind of like simpler, and just did what we needed, weren't as wide, like not engineered for as wide of an audience, let's say. Mm-hmm. And so I started replacing them and building these libraries. And then at a certain point, the inevitable thing happens is like, oh, you should open source those libraries. So yeah, I did. My component backout and component register. Backout was like a play on knockout and backbone, and is because I was replacing my previous mentor, the guy who was running that startup, had created a library called Knockback, and I was just kind of replacing that, streamlining it for our use case. So I created Backout, but essentially this had got me started on the path, because eventually I was like, I'd seen React kind of take over. I see the mentalities change, Knockout kind of fade into obscurity, and I was like, okay, we need a new way of doing this. We love using these patterns and how this works. We love the composition. We just build stuff and compose behaviors, and React wasn't really where we were at. We really liked primitives and composition, and kind of being able to define things as a bunch of functions that you can wrap. I don't know, call them hooks, let's say. And I started writing my own a framework based on kind of Knockout to do that around 2016, and I thought we were just going to use it at our company, and I wasn't like too intent on open sourcing or anything. I was just hoping that we could replace what we had, like I'd done with all those other little libraries over time. Funny thing I always like to tell people about that story is over time, I started as an intermediate dev, and by the end of the time of the company, I was basically highest technical position in that company. I made all the decisions, worked with people on the strategy vision. I wasn't even developing anymore. But so, my work on Solid actually increased the farther I got away from deving in my day job. I ended up recommending that we go to Preact or React in the end. This is back in 2018. Solid wasn't where it is today, but it actually helped a lot with what do you call it? Working, hiring, like getting new devs in and stuff. Just having that experience. When you have a custom stack, it's hard to actually hire and figure that stuff out. But the result, though, was I just kept on working on what would be SolidJs the whole time period, right from 2016. I guess I don't know if this is a follow-up question, but there's sort of a question of like, how do you, so what? I started there. How did I end up like finally choosing the open source SolidJs and go through that? Sorry, I just led right into it.
That is the next question. You're right.
Yeah, actually, so we wanted to ask.
Yeah. Okay, well, I could continue then.
This.
Keep going.
Yeah. Well, what ended up happening was, I've always been a big fan of this approach, right? This reactive primitive approach. Basically, you get these primitives that are completely independent of like any rendering or framework. They're almost like promises. You can think of them almost like a simple construct built into the language. And I love building with these things. This is what I got from Knockout, and our team had gotten used to this. And the problem was like everything was not in our favor on that side. Like people had decided that the VDOM was the champion of how you render. It was the VDOM, switch to VDOM, it's more performant, do all this stuff. And I was like, I don't know that's actually true. Like I'm not completely convinced on that. So I started benchmarking my stuff around 2017. And that's when I I was just had this private repo, and I'd kind of like seen something called the JS Framework Benchmark. And I came across a library called Surplus, which was a reactive library built on JSX, and it was the fastest on the chart. And I was like, wow, this is a reactive library that's fast. I'd been fiddling with this for like 2 years, like playing with the dials, trying different templating languages, and I was struggling with it because I could get it, in a decent performance comparable to, actually faster than a lot of things, but not like the fastest like I'd seen with this library. So I'd reached out to Adam, who was running it, and he was like pretty interested, in working together on this or getting more help, because his startup was starting to pick up and he needed to put focus there. So one of the things was he had a compiler for JSX, and I was like, okay, well, it's kind of, his own custom thing. At that time, everyone's like, let's move to Babel, because everyone uses Babel, and then you're part of that tool chain. So I basically took the kind of fundamentals of what his JSX compiler did and wrote it in Babel. And the idea was it would support, at that point when I was writing, I was like, well, I don't need to just support SJS. I could support any reactive library. So I kind of made it something, the library still existed. It's called DOM expressions. And I could basically, you bring your own reactive library, and you could get a fast JSX reactive library out of it. But one of the biggest things that I've been working on was I was really intent on playing where React was playing, so to speak. I thought that no one would like these primitives or hook type things. So I really focused hard on proxies and how to like make proxies and just plain looking JavaScript objects work. And this is something that Surplus didn't really support, and their compiler. So I kind of, at some point, I had to kind of fork like the efforts to make sure that it would work properly with proxies, like some of the heuristics and stuff, which is still fine. It was still portable, but over time, Adam basically had stopped maintaining the projects, and I just kept on adding more. I was like, oh, well, if I do this technique, I can improve performance, or I think this is dangerous, we should add safeguards. And I kept on just working on this compiler with different reactive libraries and benchmarking it. And at a certain point, I realized that like the gap had disappeared and Solid was actually the fastest library. So I open sourced it so that I could officially post it in benchmarks. So like that was basically the whole thing. And even that, you know, that's fine. I just wanted to have my library out there and just do that. But at a certain point, and I mean, I say certain point, but this date's like ingrained in my head, October 26, 2018. Dan Abramov gave a talk that introduced hooks. And I mean, at that point, I was like, oh, okay, did this just happen? Did the React decide that everyone should build stuff using primitives and composition? I'm like, this is, I just didn't even know what to do with myself at that point. I saw it. First of all, I saw that. I was like, oh, I really like these, how do you say, tuple things. I was having this problem. I learned from React that read-write segregation was very valuable, but I was having this problem that all the reactive primitives I've ever seen push them together. Like it's like you could just, they're very mutable. And it's true the underpinnings are mutable, but it's the API guarantees or contract that's important. So I wanted to keep that kind of read-write segregation in it. And I had some really fun APIs for that within Solid, like but none of them worked really nicely. And then once I saw the tuples, I was like, oh, that's what I've been looking for. So I took my primitives and added the tuples to them, and React told everyone at the same time, this is the way to go. So I was like, wow, I felt like it was like the light was shining down, you know, it's like the clouds had parted, and it was like, this is really good. And immediately I just started writing about my experience, like my year since I open sourced the library, doing the benchmarks and stuff. And I just kept on writing articles for Medium. And then for a while, articles for in-depth, and then articles for Dev2. That's actually how that all ties into how I met Lars, and all that stuff was through, I think we were really introduced through the article writing. But it was React hooks that kind of triggered it, that I was like, oh, maybe someone would be interested in this. So yeah, very long story, but it took me a very long time to get into open source, because as I said, in a sense, I was always kind of conscious of the maintenance burden right from the beginning because of how I was introduced to it. So I was kind of cautious. And sometimes you build something and you're like, I don't know, do I need to put it out there? Like, will anyone care? Like, you don't know, but sometimes those kind of things kind of make you go, who cares? You know, maybe it's not worth doing.
So Ryan, in 2018, you released the very first version of SolidJs, and then 2 years later, approximately in 2020, 2 years ago from today, you start at the Marco team at eBay. And Marco is a server-side or isomorphic framework. It's part of the OpenJS Foundation. And back then, I interviewed you in another podcast called The Deep Dive, and I've listened to it a few times recently, and I wanted to go back to the feeling, or rather, you were just starting out. What were your hopes, and what was the opportunity you were seizing? So I have a few points here, and then maybe you can reflect on them like 2 years later. How did it all turn out, and how did that impact your work on SolidJs as well? So back then you were saying that people were showing more interest in Marco's key features now, or in 2020, than they were when it was originally released in 2013. And that's something like loading fast. It was several times faster than the competition, according to you, server-side rendering, that is. It's the isomorphic experience. So that's something that was starting to pick up speed 2 years ago. eBay was growing the Marco team. They hired you. You said that they were in a good place to reach out in a world where people are starting to look for alternatives in server-side rendering and service workers and hybrid isomorphic rendering scenarios. And that over time, eBay themselves, the focus has shifted to having more logic on the client side for client-side user experiences. So you imagined that you would take the isomorphic experience to the next level by bringing in reactivity similar to Solid, or maybe even more like Svelte, because Marco also has a compiler like these two. So reflecting on this and these 2 past years, what has that experience on working full-time on an open source OpenJS project, what has it been like? Was it what you imagined, or did it take another direction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, because basically it ties right into the timeline of the story, because those articles, which got attention from people started talking about it, also caught the eyes of the guys at on the Marco team. They'd been looking for a way to improve hydration, and the key that they saw was actually getting the component boundaries were too coarse grained. Like it was too much. Like they realized that if they could cut things even smaller, they could ship even less JavaScript and run even less JavaScript. And they basically saw some of my learnings from those Solid articles, and they're like, well, yeah, let's come work on it. It was interesting because initially we were looking at almost doing something like just taking Solid's reactivity and just like jamming it right on. And that could have been a path. But the truth of the matter is, when you have a compiler like Marco and the amount of work that they've gone into that compiler, there are benefits to being able to use the compiler even further. It's an interesting trade-off because compilers less flexible, and in some places, like it's funny, people wouldn't expect this, but for like absolute raw performance, I have not yet got the compiler to actually beat out Solid in its explicitness, because the compiler has to make assumptions based on what it can analyze. But generally speaking, for the hydration problem, this has been very amazing, because we went through, before I joined, they had one prototype, which was kind of very VDOM-ish in thinking, and that's where they kind of hit the bottleneck. And Michael, in his great wisdom, Michael is a very deep thinker from the Marco team, and he was probably the one who actually saw the potential when I was talking about it and just kind of drew the lines. He was like, let's try this reactive thing. I think this is how we break it up. So we first tried to look at a lot of all these runtime things, and we were starting to test things, and we learned a lot of stuff that first 5-6 months of working on this. But that's where actually I did an article recently about comparing like the different behaviors of different reactive systems. Like you can write almost identical looking code, and then they all console log different things. It's about the consistency. We discovered that during this fairly early period of 2020 when we were doing that. But at a certain point, we were like, okay, we kept on moving to more compiled stuff. And what we ended up doing was starting to like use fixed dependencies, which is very different than runtime on the technical side, and compile them in. But that still had all these objects that we were allocating because we were treating it almost like primitives. And at a certain point, in about March 2021, Michael, I mean, he is really the thought pioneer on this side of things, especially on the hydration stuff. He's been thinking about this problem forever. He was like, instead of doing all this work and creating these things, why don't we just make it almost like vanilla JS, like Svelte-like, but fine-grained. So splitting things up using analysis on the reactive graph. If we do this smart enough, he realized, we could actually break the whole app apart in such a way that almost every component is broken into like a dozen pieces that are all top-level exports. And I know I'm getting a little technical, but by doing that, we could use normal tree shaking to shake out the static parts. Essentially, because you could tell if something was static or through analysis, and then you could just not import it from the parent that used it. It would only import the code that needed to change, and we could just tree shake it out. And by essentially top-level registering effects and event handlers, you could do that. I know I'm talking more on the technical side rather than what the experience was at UVA. I'll get to that in a minute. But around March 21, he had kind of come up with this premise and started testing and doing hand compilation. The problem is this is a really hard problem because anywhere in the graph, like anywhere in the app, you need to be able to serialize that data. That might not be obvious why, but it's because if you want to, hydrate in the client, you need certain data to be present. And when you break things apart that way, you can't just rely on serializing like the props coming to the components. You actually have to think about which points of the graph need to be serialized. So start coming up with really smart ways to reduce serialization. But then you realize you could be dealing with anything. You can be dealing with promises, you can be dealing with dates, regexes, and it's like a whole bunch of effort on serialization. And I know this is really technical, but essentially he'd come up with this really cool version of hydration where when the browser starts up, nothing runs until you click an event. And then it only runs the updates based on those specific reactive paths that you import. Luckily for us, about 3 months later, a much older idea, actually, it turns out, from 2009, time period. I think it was first shown off at a NG-Conf somewhere. Michiko Hevery basically took almost the identical idea and presented to the world and called it resumability. But it was something that actually had come out of this, for us at least, this blend of reactivity with SSR. Is actually how we landed on that. And I had been writing about that, but I think the challenges with Marco are still the challenges of Marco today, because it's hard when people don't see the value of the technology. Like on the outside, like Marco was a JavaScript framework doing MPAs and what people call the Islands framework now, back in like 2013. It also had out of order streaming like React 18 back in that time period. And like this is like a decade almost ahead of everyone else, but no one realized it was a problem yet. They were busy building single page apps, myself included. And it's weird because at one point it's an old thing. People go, yeah, maybe I've heard of that Marco thing. It's that was that thing. It's kind of like Pug, right? Like they didn't quite understand the use case initially. And the problem is, you heard me talking about it. It's technical. It's deep. You know, like there's a lot of nuance in how this stuff works. So we talk about it like the way we talk, like, you know, React talks about suspense and transitions. It's like this advanced thing that is really cool and does amazing stuff. And those people are like, wow. But there's a discrepancy between that and the natural audience that would actually use Marco, because it's not the app makers and the people necessarily creating the most complex apps that would have used Marco historically. It's the people who just want to make a content site or something really simple, or an e-commerce site. And the fact that Marco, basically, you just write code in Marco, a whole app in Marco, just nothing special, and it would just auto-generate the islands for you without you even doing anything. It just was smart enough to know exactly where the islands were, and make them as small as possible and to get the best performance. So this is very hard to explain because people have no frame of reference to even compare to. So I found most of my effort at Marco, actually, it was my writing that actually was the biggest benefit that I could have. And obviously, working through the prototype design thought area, there's always questions about reactivity, how things should behave, and using that understanding of these systems. But generally speaking, I feel like that was the biggest impact I could make over those 2 years of documentation and writing, surprisingly, because it's kind of like an education thing. And it's not enough just to be like, have good docs and educate people. I had to almost try and educate, like use Twitter and use different mediums to try to educate the ecosystem on a wider sense, just so they can be aware of these concepts. Luckily, I could see them coming down the pipeline from other frameworks. So I could kind of be like, look, this is coming in React in a couple of years. This is important. and it kind of worked, but not, you know, it's a lot easier when you have a much louder voice. So it's basically, it was definitely still a challenge, because one of the challenges of being like first sometimes is by the time everyone gets there themselves, things have changed a bit, and people don't really associate the same kind of things. They're just like, oh yeah, this is that older technology. Because you have to imagine, back in the day, there was no Vite. There was none of these modern tools that we have today. So like Marco had to.
We remember. We don't have to imagine.
I don't. I'm not old enough in the JavaScript ecosystem, thankfully.
Marco had to create their own bundler. They had something called Lasso. And
oh man,
what Lasso? I mean, why do you want to maintain your own bundler and framework and all this stuff in a small couple man team? Not really. But Lasso was still used heavily at eBay. And what was Lasso? Well, Lasso is a bundler that built stuff on demand. So it was like a lazy bundler. So it would do some pre-bundling for you, but essentially, for the most part, it would only bundle the stuff as it was needed. And we actually use that in production too. So like it actually can, if you got like 180 different languages you have to worry about, like we can kind of not have to build all those ahead of time. So like, well, it doesn't slow down the CI kind of deal. But the reason I wanted to kind of point this out is Lasso is another perfect prime example of this kind of project, because in some ways, it took years for these kind of things to actually go mainstream, because there was no need for them. Webpack and Rollup, which is amazing. I love Rollup, and eventually Snowpack and the Beat. Like that kind of timeline. It took a while to kind of get to where we are today. But like Lasso was doing the basically no bundle thing back in 2014 or whatever, or 13. But no one was interested at the time. Like that's Vite's thing, right? Like that they don't bundle stuff. It's all on demand, right?
Hmm.
But this is the thing. If someone tried to use Lasso today, they'd probably be disgusted about how like old and clunky it is. But like this is kind of the world. It was really hard. It's hard to fight against the grain and build all this stuff in a world which like isn't ready for it. So yeah, it was definitely a challenge, and I still love the work that's going on with the Marco team. I mean, I had to be fair, there was a lot of advocating that needed to go along, not just publicly, even internally. eBay went through a large management change a couple of years ago. There's an incident, and the whole upper management, large chunks of it kind of has been switching over the last year as like kind of eBay's kind of been modernizing itself, which means new tech objectives, moving faster, starts calling to question where the value is of Marco, when there's a clear technical value, but you have to weigh that with developer experience value. So it was an interesting challenge to kind of get in a bit into the larger company politics, and basically advocating for Marco both internally and externally with eBay. Luckily, there was a great team there working on this stuff. The wider platform team that supports the Marco team on the website is amazing, and they always supported us and made sure we got what we needed and that we had a good voice. But generally speaking, like there's always a temptation of using different technologies, even when they might not fit best, just because that's what people are familiar with. And definitely working on an open source project in a big company is a different kind of thing because of that. Because you have to be aware, like there's like we got halted several times on Marco 6. Partially, it was okay because we knew we had to do a lot of research and we had to take time. But it was like, eBay needs this, so maybe we should slightly change our prioritization. Work on micro front ends or something. And it's fine because, as I said, some of these ideas need time to think and thoughts to progress. And when you have a small team, there's only so much you can do. But yeah, I mean, at certain times, I built a Urkel GraphQL solution, and some of this stuff. You might be like, oh, I mean, this library's out. You would have got this for free if you're working on React. Like, there's already Urkel React and stuff. But the funniest thing was, I went and I reached out to the community actually in 2021, and I'm like, streaming is coming to React. You guys have been seeing the writing on the wall. I need help figuring out how to do streaming GraphQL. And some of you might get what the problem is. But the problem is, generally speaking, you're doing a bunch of queries essentially, and you stream out the response. And most solutions assume that you serialize all the data at the end, and that's present at the beginning of hydration in the client, and then you can hydrate with that data, like the cache. That's how all the instructions work, how everything works. But the truth of the matter is, with a streaming solution, you have to do it incrementally, because you can't guarantee that all the data is there up front when you're hydrating, and because you haven't been able to serialize it because it's still coming in as it's streaming. So I had to jump through some hoops, especially because we wanted to support Marco's use case, so that if there was queries that were only being done on the server, that we could even skip shipping the whole client-side GraphQL library and have this all automatically happen for you. You just write your code as normal, and the compiler's smart enough to separate all those use cases and optimize it. So
did you solve it before you left?
Yes, yeah. I solved it around Christmas time last year. But it was just funny because I reached out to the React community and I was like, "How do we do this? You guys must be starting to work on this." And people weren't ready for this conversation. Sorry, that might be coming from me. Yeah, it is. Sorry, but. Yeah, there wasn't awareness of this. And then when I asked, they're like, oh, the React core team was like, well, we're working with specific partners to solve these problems. And rather than actually, just having it out there and documentation in the ecosystem, because we're still figuring it out. And I was like, oh, okay, so I'm glad everyone's still figuring this stuff out, because it's actually complicated. But this was kind of like this is what I was talking about. When you're kind of there first, you have a lot of extra work to do to kind of solve and figure out these patterns, and a lot of that was going on with Marco.
Yeah. So can we fast forward? Jay, you can take us to 2021.
Yeah. So
now, Jay, do you have our questions at hand?
Yeah, I do. Where do we fast forward to 2021? So in 2021, you released V1. of SolidJS.
Yeah.
Did you imagine that you were ever going to, back in, I guess it was 2018, you released 0.0.1. Did you imagine you were ever going to be working full time on V1 of SolidJS?
Yeah, I mean, at 2018, no. Like at the beginning, like I was just benchmarking, and I didn't think I'd be doing like I figured, like maybe my company would adopt it, maybe a few people. I did not have that expectation. V1 took a very, very long time though. Still, like because I figured I would still V1. So like, maybe some people like after hooks, I was like, oh, okay, so this could be a thing. That's when the switch happened. And I was like, okay, well, I should work towards V1. So in 2019, I remember late 2019, I was like, yeah, we're very close to V1. I imagine it'll be a couple more months. I'm just going to finish this work, and then I'm going to make a real world demo and get it in the real world demo comparison. And if I can make a good real world demo and everything, I'm happy with everything, we should reach V1. And something happened there around February 2020. And again, this ties in, it was right before the Marco thing, but I started benchmarking the real world demo. And Solid's client, I noticed that most of the solutions are SSR'd, but Solid's client side rendering was outscoring them. So it's getting higher Lighthouse scores than like Sapper and all the SSR solutions with just client side rendering. So I mean, at first I was just like, yeah, of course it's fast, but I mean, that is not the right take. You know what I mean? Like, it was easy for me to do that. But what I noticed was a couple, I think it was Hacker News PWA or something. A couple of the ones were using something called was it web perf or web test? If I start typing the URL, it's going to tell me which one. Web page test to kind of compare these things, not just use Lighthouse scores and look at timelines. And they were doing it with mobile, and I was getting beat very badly. And then I started playing around and stuff, and it became very clear to me, if you have a fast network, client side rendering and stuff can actually be faster than SSR, especially all the SSR solutions at the time, which were buffered async. What I mean is they do all the requests, then they render, and then they send it back. And I realized, I was like, oh, this kind of is unfortunate. Maybe I actually do need an SSR solution. So I put 1.0 on hold so that I could build an SSR solution. And I started looking at different SSR solutions and enter Marco, right? So like it was actually really good time. They reached out to me, but like the timing was exactly what I was looking for at the time. So Solid spent the next, I guess, year-ish working on coming up with the fastest SSR solutions, adding things like streaming and stuff, basically stuff that I'd learned from Marco. So that finally, I even started working on Meta Framework Solid Start around this time back in March 2021, and I was just like, I was like, no, I put it all on hold in April, and I was like, I'm going to write docs, and then we're going to get 1.0, and then people will finally, like, it will give people a reason to finally try things. So I sat down and didn't do any bug fixes or improvements on Solid for 6 weeks and wrote the original docs and tutorials that we see on the website, with the help of a bunch of other people actually who built the website. I didn't build the website, I just built the content for it. So it was a big push. It's like 2 months of basically leaving Solid as was, and then to get that 1.0 release. And I mean, it was a huge change, shift of perspective. Suddenly all those, people who'd kind of been like, oh yeah, it's Solid, interesting, we're like, hey, check it out. And everything kind of has blown up a ton since then.
Crazy. Wild that you were like, oh, we're about to release, and then suddenly just, we need an SSR solution, so let's go build that.
Yeah, I mean, it was good. We learned stuff over time. I'm always okay with stuff taking its time if we can make sure we're building the right things. I know there's a pressure to get out there first and do all that, but it's like, yeah, it's just where I sit personally. I was so long on 1.0. Some people are like, we have Meta Framework Solid Start. They're just like, release it already, or at least make it beta already. I'm like, no. We're gonna make sure that we're happy with it. So yeah, I'm kind of terrible that way. There's such a temptation to go on Twitter and be like, bam, and even not even have anything. Just have like the idea. Like, I figured out how to do blank. We've been very careful both on Solid and on Marco, because you got to imagine Marco like over a year ago, when we first figured out resumability, we could have gone really loud about that, but it was like, no, we're going to make sure that we can build it. It was only actually of May of this year that I finally like revealed some of the secrets and showed some benchmark numbers. I've been sitting on benchmarks for Marco 6 and examples for like almost a year, but I was like, no, we got to make sure we figured stuff out so things are unlikely to change, because setting the right expectations is really important, because ultimately, even with a team like Marco, which was hired by eBay, there's only a couple of us, and there's so many more of everyone out there in the community. If you set the right expectations, then you build trust, and then that's like your best capital in open source. Like, because people are doing this on their own time. They're volunteering. You need them to be successful. You need them to be excited and interested. So you can't. There's no point kind of going for short-term boosts, I don't think. I mean, maybe it works for some people because then they get interest and that gets more people in. But I'm much more worried about disappointing people, and then that having a negative effect in the long run.
Totally fair. Yeah, no, I can definitely understand that. And it can definitely be a hard balance between like, waiting too long, like, oh no, like we need to figure these things out, versus like, releasing something and then everyone being like, what the hell? And then like never wanting to go back. It's like, oh, my first experience was awful, right? It's definitely getting a little bit of a hard balance. Anyway, I need to drop out because I have a meeting here in a couple of minutes. It was nice meeting you, Ryan. Lars, I'll leave it in your capable hands.
Yeah, I will. Thank you. Good seeing you, Jay.
Yeah, you as well. Nice meeting you, Ryan.
Nice meeting you.
I will hopefully talk to you guys soon.
Yeah, I can stay. Ryan, when do you have to leave?
Yeah, I mean, we got a bit more time. I think we originally booked, what was it, the hour at least. Is what we originally booked to 9:30.
Oh, great. Well, we'll continue for another 10-15 minutes max, then we'll stop. This about disappointing people. It reminds me, because now you actually have a lot to live up to, you and the team at Solid. In the 2021 State of JavaScript, you scored high. Like, you were the top framework in satisfaction and the second most favorable in terms of interest in the framework. So now there's a chance to disappoint or satisfy a lot of people. So how do you manage that?
This is one of those places where we're talking about that balance, right? And how, if you can spike it too early, then it's awkward. I'm okay with this, and I'm fairly confident that we'll, like, it's hard to go when you're like number one. It's hard to, like, there's only one way to go, so to speak. But if I've been watching Svelte, I have some amount of hope there. See, the thing is, this wasn't of our doing, so to speak. Like, it's not like, the difference here is, it wasn't something we were trying to push. What had happened was, State of JavaScript survey got pushed back a month or two. I don't know if you remember. And it was because of some of the administration stuff around COVID and all that. So usually that survey goes out and it all completes in December. But what had happened, and because I asked Sasha, who runs it, I was like, how did Solid get shortlisted? Because I have to admit, the second I saw Solid was shortlisted, I was like, this is going to be a good year for us. Like, because it's just a mathematical thing. This is not about any. If you have a library with a bunch of early adopters, your chances of satisfaction are incredibly high among that group, and there's probably not that many of them. So it just skews the stats completely. Like, I knew this right from the get-go, the second I saw that we were there. So I had to ask Sasha, I was like, how did we get there? And he's like, well, we looked at the rising stars of GitHub. Like, we looked at the other surveys and end of year stuff and to make our decision. And Solid showed up as in the top 5 frameworks with the most GitHub stars that year. And I'm like, yeah, because we did our 1.0 release. There's always a spike when you release your 1.0. So it was enough that Solid that was the 5th. That just made the cut for the top rising stars for frameworks, JavaScript frameworks, right? And I'm just giving you an idea. It was like a good number. I think we got almost the same number of stars as Angular, like new stars that year, which is insane to us. Obviously, React, Vue, and Svelte were the big movers, but this is a completely different category for where we were standing, and it was just because you spike a 1.0 release, right? And then we're shortlisted. So, I mean, it's likely that we do well on this survey just because only, what was it, like 2% of users or 3% of users had used Solid out of the survey, but 90% satisfaction among those users.
Yeah.
That's what we aim for, but it's also not the hardest metric to hit. Right? Because you spend the care and time. At that point, if someone had a problem with Solid, they come to our GitHub or Discord, and you had about an 80% chance that I'd be answering the question myself personally. Like that service, like, so to speak, like, and
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing about the Discord, that there's a high chance it's very active. Like you can actually get your questions answered if you're looking for just support when using Solid.
And I love that about the Discord, and I think it's like lead by example. People saw me doing this, like literally almost answering every support question coming in, so other people start picking it up, and now there's this like community almost around it in the Discord where people jump on the support channel, and pretty much every question we started threading them so we could see them, and you can see which ones have been responded to. That almost every question gets answered, which has been growing and growing and growing. So yeah, I mean, a lot of good luck. I mentioned like how much of my story have I told you? It's been like just making the most of a situation and then being lucky. Like obviously I was working on the stuff in the core part of Solid and doing the open source and the benchmarking. That was just me playing around, right? So that's fine. But then what are the chances that React lands on a pattern that looks like Solid? I don't know. What are the chances that I mean, maybe I started writing those articles and maybe that's worth something, but the chance someone picks up those articles, I don't know. What's the chances of the COVID delaying the state of JavaScript survey so that our star spike actually gets us on the short list? Because then it just keeps on going, because after state of JavaScript, at some Fireship decided to do a video, Fireship Dev, and that had like 350,000 views and like huge push. We've been just every few months been getting a giant push because someone new finds Solid and sees the value in it. So this has been just kind of, I don't know, like very thankful for how this just keeps on, kind of rolling. I don't even know how it does, and then, at a certain point, sponsors started jumping on Open Collective, which helped a lot. Fun stuff like hackathons, right? We had Builder and Netlify jump on, and then a whole bunch of others after that. Div Riots, Stitches, like a whole bunch. Vercel, and at some point, I find myself getting offered to work full time on this at Netlify. So I mean, I know we haven't got there yet, but that this has all just been like an incredible couple of years from my perspective, and it wasn't. Mostly, it was just from just trying to do the most of what I had. If that makes any sense.
So you say luck. I mean, I say consistency meets opportunity.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, that's kind of like the mindset, right? Some of the mantras, you keep on doing good stuff, you do good work, put yourself in the right places with the right opportunities, should, in theory, eventually come around. But yeah, I mean, it's been quite a ride this past year, definitely.
Let's move on to talk about now. You're starting at Netlify. It was very recently, right?
Yeah. It's funny because I had all these vacations planned. It's like end of COVID. I mean, it's not end. Like the numbers are actually kind of on a rise right now. But generally speaking, the kind of everybody's like triple vaccinated or whatever, quadruple, I guess, is starting now. Like things have kind of opened up again, and I was like, I need to go visit my grandfather. And so I'd already planned like a trip to Canada and road trip and do all this thing, maybe see the US. So it was kind of funny because the whole Netlify thing came across, and I started with Netlify. And then I went on vacation for a month, and then I just got back. So I haven't. People keep on going like, "How is it like?" And I'm like, I'm still finding my ground. But what's really cool is to be able to get up in the morning and go, let's see what the issues are. Let's check out the Discord and kind of have a plan that I have kind of laid out with my manager and figure out like what I want to do in terms of the different projects on open source I want to work on. But then to be able to just kind of work in all that Twitter, Discord, GitHub stuff into my workflow during the day. That was always one of the challenges. When I was working on Marco, I tried really hard to be like Marco during the day, Solid at night, and keep those things separate. I mean, it wasn't always the same. Like if I'm on Twitter already doing some stuff, if I have that slot for doing promotional kind of stuff for the frameworks, I'll do both at the same time. But for the most part, I wasn't doing solid commits during the middle of the day. And I would see something and I'd be like, okay, I guess that's put on the list for later. And I was kind of working 2 full-time jobs. Now I have a little bit more flexibility. Here's the thing. I'm not necessarily working that much less because I've been doing this for years, but I am. It's easier when you can prioritize and balance stuff and have that like ability at my work to be like, okay, no, this takes priority now, instead of pushing it later because it makes sense to do it now. And so it makes me have to switch gears less and be able to focus on stuff more. And so already I'm seeing benefits to my whole workflows and perhaps long-term mental health.
So what's the plan, or what do you know, or what do you expect? Like, how much of your daytime job time, your working hours, do you get to spend on contribution to SolidJS, and how much is on other products within the Netlify brand?
So far, I've been doing mostly SolidJS. To be fair, my mandate isn't so much about stuff within Netlify itself. Like I do talk a lot with the framework guys who do all the like integrations and ecosystem and like that part, but generally it's open source. So the kind of things, to give you an idea, like yes, I early on here I've been just working on Solid Start, kind of reinforcing that as we kind of figured out the plan, and I was away for a long period of time. But like another thing I'm working on is benchmarks, like looking at ways that we can benchmark all the frameworks, get a better idea of SSR and hydration and performance. This is important because it both are useful tools for people working on frameworks to improve. That was like the biggest benefit of benchmarks. I use that to be able to tune and understand, but it's also helpful for frameworks that are performance oriented to get more exposure and for people to understand the benefits, right? This is a problem I struggle with Marco, and Quick struggles with, and Astro. All these like islands MPA frameworks are having a real hard time actually showcasing the performance element. Like they can do a lighthouse speed and pick a arbitrary page, and be like, "Whoa, look how much faster it is." But actually having better understanding of the impact of the decisions we make can let us build better stuff. So like that's something, obviously, when I pitched that to Netlify, they were like, "Yeah, no, that's great. That could benefit everyone." I view my work on my streams kind of an extension of this too. I look at other frameworks and I build projects with them, mostly Hacker News demos for comparison, but so that I can kind of expose people to these frameworks, see what ideas come from it, and then be able to draw generalizations and understanding, so it can kind of let people know where things are heading. And I think these kind of things, and I'm continuing to write articles too, being able to like general knowledge articles about like either how frameworks behave, patterns for building apps, and that kind of stuff. So I have a definitely framework author kind of tilt, I guess the term, which is definitely a bit of a unique perspective. So Netlify has been supporting me in all of these efforts. In the future, I would like to do, some other stuff, which will hopefully kind of tie back into more on the runtime side, improves, framework integration with edge function stuff. But for the most part right now, I'd say that I'm like 80% focused on Solid at the moment, but I can see that number kind of shifting, as.
What do you, so now you're at the beginning of your journey at Netlify, working primarily on Solid. So what's your hope for the next 2 years doing this job?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting position to be in, because when you work for a company, they hire people to specifically work on it, right? So, and that has its benefits, but it's also usually the company has an invested interest and they're going to like kind of direct things, like we saw with eBay. And I'm sure Meta is the same thing. I talked to Dan, like it's the same deal. And if you have experience with Angular, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And with Netlify, it's a little different because it's a little bit more hands off. They really just want to see positive benefit. Like they benefit from everyone doing well, and then everyone going, I should deploy to Netlify, right? Like, so like making positive benefit just reflects good on them. So my hope is in the next couple of years, I do want to leverage this opportunity to really help the Solid community, right? As like a first thing, I'm working on tools, but I'm using this time to actually not just do development, but actually build up, infrastructure things to help open source, like the communities come together and be able to build and like make, look at things maybe like government's models to try and figure out how we can make this community sustainable. That's kind of like the narrow focus on the Solid side. On the wider focus, when I'm thinking of the wider ecosystem, I want to continue to create an environment place where innovation and unique things like Quick and Marco I mentioned are being able to get showcased in a way. So that's I said, benchmarking is part of that effort. I would be happy that in 2 years, we can get to a point where these other solutions, things that are kind of on the edge of where we are today, like in terms of new techniques, are able to shine in the forefront, right? So I'm very dedicated to building out examples, helping with features for, as I said, Astro, Marco, Quick, Svelte, or whatever, anyone who's pushing the boundaries, right? I was really, really actually stoked to see this past week. I was just playing around my benchmarks like I do. And Svelte had just pulled in a PR that was based on some work we'd done on Solid 2 years ago, and it doubled the speed of their SSR. And like having that kind of positive impact wider is just awesome, because I looked at the chart, and that was a very direct case, but that puts pressure on others. And if you look at the chart, every framework has improved their SSR speed in the past year or so. Like some smaller than others, but they're like, obviously they're focusing on it, and it's good to be able to celebrate that, to be able to put that out there, to notice it, and kind of just see this whole thing moving forward. So I mean, Netlify is an incredible vehicle for that. So yeah, it's a very interesting position I'm in, because as I said, I get to be a developer, but I get to do a lot of work with people and projects, and understand, it isn't that far off. I've been doing this for a while anyways in my own time, and being able to be officially supported to do this is amazing.
That's great. I hope it'll turn out to be everything you're hoping for. Ryan, we can either wrap up now, or if you can spare another 5 minutes, there's 3 questions from the community.
Yeah, let's get to those questions in chat.
Okay, great. First one here is the Tanav. Does Netlify support streaming? You were talking about the streaming of GraphQL and things like that.
Or maybe HTTP streaming of responses, because that's been like the big topic this week. Because React 18 has streaming, Solid has streaming, Marco has streaming. To my knowledge, those are the only 3. But big one is React. Like I mentioned, Solid got streaming a couple of years ago. Marco's had it since 2013. React 18 just got that out of order streaming, so it's a big deal. And the guys from Remix were like, "Bad news for you guys. Most platforms don't support streaming." And I was like, well, that's good. Keep on drumming that up. I mentioned it to a year ago on Twitter. I was like, Dan, I'm so stoked that you're adding streaming to React. I think people will finally add it to their platforms and their tooling. It's not there yet. But Netlify,
what's the server side requirement? Like, what's needed to support it?
Well, the thing is, I think it just has to do with it's definitely like on the edge of the runtime meets the infrastructure side, because Nodes has supported streams, obviously, and stream responses forever. But a lot of the time when people made the serverless infrastructure, they didn't. AWS, being a noteworthy one, doesn't support chunked encoding of stream responses. So, but on the other hand, Cloudflare does, and Dino Deploy does. So actually, and those actually supply the edge functions for almost every platform. Like Cloudflare is Cloudflare and Vercel, and Dino Deploy is Dino Deploy and Netlify. So Netlify Edge supports streaming because it has Dino. But all the normal non-edge functions right now are on AWS Lambda for both Vercel and Netlify, and those do not support streaming. So it's a half and half. If you want to do streaming, you have to use edge functions today. But I know for a fact, it's been shared with me, that this is something that is being worked on that will be changing pretty soon.
Interesting. Next one is from Chien Bui. What's the best approach for a succession plan for an open source project, especially when there's no financial backing?
Interesting. When you say succession plan, do you mean, so is that
You were
success?
talking about when you joined that company, the startup company, and the lead developer left, and they had all these
Yeah.
open source projects, and
That's what I thought you were. I thought that's what I thought you were asking. But that's the harder question. I'm like, success plan. I'm like, okay, but succession plan is actually
succession plan,
is actually a much harder question.
sunsetting or passing the torch, whatever you want to call it.
That's one of the hardest problems and one of the challenges we have with open source, because what ends up happening is things that don't get picked up by companies, even projects widely used, they usually at a certain point the maintainer gets more and more work, and then they can't maintain it anymore, and then it drops. And we've seen this happen over and over and over and over again. So it's challenging, right? Like I'm not sure there is a great like single solution there. Like one of the things we can do when your project gets successful enough, and depending on the type of project, like is kind of share the, like pull more people into the core, make it bigger, share the thing, change the government's model, have it more openly governed, kind of move on from the benevolent dictator model, usually, which is all kind of open source projects start with, and get to a point where you have like committees and like they'll go do the whole thing, kind of like the way OpenJS runs, right? Those are projects that are too big to fail, so to speak. But if you're just writing a library, maybe special purpose, and then like it blows up, it depends. Maybe that's not easy to do. Like there's tons of libraries that have a very narrow scope, but still have a ton of work, and because they're just used so much. So this is one of the problems plaguing open source. It's why companies are getting more involved in directly supporting these projects, because you never know. Like even in large companies, they're not safe for this. I remember someone pointed out, because Flow has kind of got deprecated, right? Like the TypeScript alternative from Facebook. Well, it was revealed when they did that. Everyone was some people were kind of choked, and they're like, "Well, here's the truth." The guy's like, "I'm the only maintainer at Facebook on Flow. I'm the only maintainer, and when I say only maintainer, I haven't really had the time. Like the company hasn't given me any time to maintain it, like during work hours, for over a year now." This is not easy, and some projects that can obviously benefit from kind of committee style, like, and kind of spreading it, but other projects, like it doesn't make sense, or people aren't. And I don't know if there's a concern that there's going to be like a crisis in open source and this stuff starts crumbling. But I mean, it's been like this all along. I mean, yeah, I don't know. This is a very difficult question that I don't have an answer to.
But to be clear, you're not the only one working on SolidJS. Like there's more than one team of people,
right,
contributing.
But yeah, and that's been like this shift over time. But if you went back 2 years ago, less so. You know what I mean? Like I think I just found like David had joined on with the logo and the community side. There might have been 2 of us or 3 of us at that point. Now we have a 7-person core team. We have like pods of people, like 3 people on Solid Start. Small, like maybe 4 or 5-person docs team. Like there's a whole bunch of different teams and sub teams, and figuring out that organization definitely helps. But I mean, I don't know if every project that gets popular can benefit from that kind of structure. Like for a framework, there's enough of a, how should I put it? Like there's enough of a purview, like it's ambitious enough to cover enough area that you can really divide it up that way. It might be harder for like a library. There's libraries that have like millions of downloads, and they do, a couple things. And yeah, what happens when that maintainer is like, I'm done, guys.
Okay. Last question is from Arangi Toar. What does it mean to have a 1.0 release like you had with SolidJS in 2021? Does it mean something like all the features planned for whatever the scope of 1.0 is, and they are production ready? Or what was your milestone for your 1.0 release?
Yes. Mostly, if you follow strictly Semver, you're thinking about breaking changes in terms of APIs. So it was kind of a bit of both. The reactive system hadn't changed very much for years. The whole client-side render story. So that, as I mentioned, that was that was my criteria. And from that perspective, Solid was ready for 1.0, like in 2019, right? Like when I was originally talking. But I wanted to make sure that the SSR solution didn't drastically change how we did client side. It turned out that it did not. So it wasn't that big of a deal. But to be fair, I would say for 1.0 release of Solid, in my mind, it was like the client side rendering is as rock solid as we could make it, sorry pun, and like in terms of the APIs, and the API is not changing. SSR, when you have a project like ours, lower user bases, I knew that the APIs are good, but I there was no way that I could ensure that it was at the time that it was like bug free. We just needed to get usage. But as long as you know that like that the APIs are good and that part isn't changed, then it's okay to be a little bit buggy on the SSR side, for example, for us, and fix the bugs as we go. And that's the last year SSR has been like the area that we've made the biggest improvements. So yeah, I mean, generally speaking, 1.0 is a flag for production ready. I knew that people wouldn't be able to get started with SSR very easily without like a meta framework like Next. So I wasn't too worried about that side. I personally only know that SSR works really well on small demos. I haven't actually built a huge full app on SSR. When we built the Solid website, it was actually client side rendered. It still is. We're moving it to SSR right now. So yes, it's mostly about API lockdown from my perspective, but I also knew that the client side story was production ready.
Awesome. Okay, so wrapping up, Brian, is there anything or anyone you want to promote?
Yeah. Okay. It's funny. I should be always prepared for this question because it always comes at the end. Yeah, generally speaking, if you haven't heard of it, there's been a ton of innovation happening on the MPA space. And I know this is a throw out again to my guys, Marco, but I mentioned them a bunch in the stream, but take a look at what Marco's been doing, Quick and Astro. All three of those projects have really been pushing the envelope in terms of to the point that others are starting to adopt these approaches in their frameworks. We're seeing new stuff come out like Fresh and whatnot. But yeah, definitely check out those frameworks. I think they're doing a lot of really innovative work, and I've been covering them on my own stream. Yeah, beyond also, obviously check out Solid if you haven't checked out Solid. But I just wanted to, the Discords are where these things live, and all these projects actually have great Discords. So you should, if you do have an interest, go join the Discord, ask questions, learn about it. I think that's the main thing for me. Other than that, I probably want to just advertise that I do stream on Twitch and YouTube as well. Oh. So that's how I've been sharing my learnings every Friday at 12 Pacific time. I do a stream, which I guess is pretty late in Europe, but it's better than before. I used to stream at 8 Pacific time, and that would be like in the middle of the night. So yeah, I believe I'm youtube.com. Like my user is like Ryan Carniato 9. But honestly, just find me on Twitter and you'll find everything you need. Always very open to discuss all things frameworks, performance, reactivity.
Nice. Okay, so next week on This is Tech Talks, we have Hiral Gilani joining us to talk about SEO for small businesses. So that's it for today. Thank you so much for coming, Ryan, and I hope I get an opportunity to get back to this, ask you in 2 years' time, how was the experience working 2 years for Netlify on the Solid project?
Yeah, I look forward to it. I think we'll be in a really awesome place then.
Okay, that's the end of This is Tech Talks. See you next week.